On a grey morning in March 1955, in a cramped flat above a drinking club on Brompton Road, a woman sat before a mirror. Her left eye was swollen shut, a bruise spreading from cheekbone to temple in shades of violet and ochre. Her lower lip was split, the wound still fresh enough to sting when she pressed her mouth together. She reached for a bottle of hydrogen peroxide and began, with the absent efficiency of long habit, to bleach her hair, methodically, steadily, as though this were the most important task in the world. 2 weeks earlier, the man she loved had struck her in the stomach. She had been carrying his child. She was no longer carrying his child. The peroxide fizzed against her scalp. In the mirror, the bruise stared back at her. She did not look away. She never looked away. That was the thing about Ruth Ellis. She had learned, long before this morning, that pain was something you absorbed, concealed, and carried on despite. You bleached your hair. You painted your lips. You put on your heels and walked downstairs and poured gin for strangers and laughed at their jokes, and if your hands trembled, you held the glass tighter. In 3 weeks, she would fire 5 bullets into the man who gave her that bruise, outside a public house in Hampstead on Easter Sunday. In 3 months, she would become the last woman to be executed in Great Britain. But on this morning, she was simply dyeing her hair, because that was how she had always survived, by transforming herself into whatever the world demanded. Until the evening she stopped. To understand this moment before the mirror, the peroxide, the bruise, the terrifying stillness, one must travel back 29 years, to a house on the Welsh coast where a small girl first learnt the only rule that mattered: silence. In the Nielsen household, there was one rule that nobody ever spoke aloud. Everyone knew it. Everyone obeyed it. The rule was simple. Whatever happened inside this house did not exist. Ruth was born on the 9th of October, 1926, in the seaside town of Rhyl, Denbighshire, on the north coast of Wales. She arrived into a family of 6 children, a household perpetually short of money and perpetually thick with tension. Her father, Arthur Hornby, who would later change the family surname to Nielsen, reportedly to obscure his partly Belgian ancestry, was a musician who played on ocean liners. He would vanish for months at a time, crossing the Atlantic while his wife and children managed without him. And then he would return, and the house would contract, as though the walls themselves drew closer together. Her mother, Elizabeth, whom everyone called Bertha, was a quiet, withdrawn woman with the particular stillness of someone who has long since surrendered to circumstances beyond her control. Bertha cooked. Bertha cleaned. Bertha kept her eyes on the floor and her mouth shut. The children watched her and understood. This was how women endured. Rhyl in the late 1920s was a place of salt wind and coal smoke, of boarding houses that smelt of damp wallpaper, of grey sea under grey sky. It was not destitution. The family ate, the children had shoes, but it was poverty of a grinding, relentless kind, the sort that leaves no room for softness. Ruth shared beds with siblings. She wore handed-down clothes. She knew the price of bread before she knew how to read, but it was not the poverty that shaped her. It was the secret. Years later, decades later, in the course of a legal appeal filed in 2003, Ruth's older sister Muriel would make a statement under oath. The statement concerned their father. Arthur Nielsen, Muriel testified, had systematically subjected her to sexual abuse throughout her childhood. She had fallen pregnant by him at the age of 14. The police had been called. They had questioned Arthur. They had let him go. Bertha had known. Bertha had said nothing. Muriel's statement went further. Ruth, she alleged, had suffered the same abuse from the age of 11. This allegation was never proved in a court of law. It was Muriel's word, the word of an elderly woman looking back across half a century of silence. It cannot be verified, and it must be treated with the caution that unproven claims demand. But it was made under oath, by a woman who had no reason to fabricate her own childhood, and it casts a long, dark shadow over everything that followed. Whether or not Ruth herself was a victim of her father, she grew up in a house where such things happened and where the response to them was silence. Not the silence of ignorance, the silence of complicity. Bertha knew, the walls knew, the children knew, and nobody spoke. Ruth absorbed this lesson so completely that it became the architecture of her entire life. She would say nothing when her husband beat her. She would say nothing when her lover beat her. She would say nothing in a courtroom when a single honest answer might have saved her from the rope. In 1939, when Ruth was 13, war came. The family had by then moved, first to Hampshire, then to London, and the child from the Welsh coast found herself in a city being torn apart by German bombs. The Blitz rearranged not just the streets of London, but the social rules that governed them. In the chaos of nightly air raids, evacuation orders, and ration books, the old certainties crumbled. Ruth left school at 14. There was no discussion about it, no agonizing over lost opportunities. Working-class girls in wartime London did not stay in school. She found work in a factory, then as a waitress, then in a series of small jobs that paid little and demanded much. She was slight, dark-haired, unremarkable, but she was watching. She was watching the women who came into the cafes where she worked, women with lipstick and good coats, women who smoked cigarettes from holders and who spoke in voices that did not betray where they had come from. She was watching and she was learning. London in wartime was a city without rules, a city where the normal order of things had been suspended indefinitely, and where a young woman with nothing to her name could discover, for the first time, that beauty was a currency as negotiable as any other. She was 17 when she met him. He was considerably older. He wore a uniform and spoke French. He had a wedding ring, which he removed before entering the pub. His name was Claire Andrea McCallum, a married Canadian soldier, some accounts say Quebecois, stationed in wartime London. The affair was brief. The consequences were not. Ruth fell pregnant. On the 15th of September 1944, she gave birth to a son. She named him Claire Andrea, after his father, in the peculiar hope of absent men that giving a child a name might substitute for giving him a presence. Everyone would call the boy Andy. McCallum disappeared. The modest financial support he had provided dried up within a year. He returned to Canada, to his wife, to whatever life awaited him across the Atlantic, and he left behind an 18-year-old girl with a baby, no education, no skills, and the indelible stigma that post-war Britain reserved for unmarried mothers. In the England of 1945, a woman with a child born out of wedlock was not merely unfortunate. She was fallen. The word carried the full weight of Victorian morality, and it pressed down on Ruth like a stone. She had two choices. She could take a factory job for subsistence wages, raise her son in a bedsit, and spend the next 40 years in quiet, respectable misery. Or she could step into the other London, the London that came alive after dark, where the rules were different, and where a woman's face and figure could open doors that her birth had sealed shut. She chose the darkness, and it was not, as moralists would later suggest, a fall. It was a climb. The girl who walked into the court club in the spring of 1946 was dark-haired, softly spoken, and wearing a dress refashioned from an old curtain. The woman who, a year later, would be pouring champagne for London's black market dealers and demobbed officers was a platinum blonde with a cigarette holder, a gin and tonic, and a voice from which every trace of Wales had been meticulously erased. The transformation was not accidental, it was architectural. Ruth did not drift into the world of Soho hostess clubs. She engineered her own reinvention, piece by piece, the way an actress constructs a character, studying the mannerisms, the accent, the walk, the tilt of the head, peroxide on the hair, a new way of holding a glass, laughter pitched precisely between warmth and distance. The problem, as with all roles played too long, was that the character eventually consumed the person beneath. Post-war London was a city of ruins and possibilities. Whole neighbourhoods lay in rubble. Rationing would continue, astonishingly, until 1954. But in Soho and Mayfair, in the basement clubs and the upstairs bars, a parallel world thrived, a world of spivs and black marketeers, of aristocrats burning through inherited money, of racing drivers and former RAF pilots with demob pay and nowhere to spend it. This was the demimonde, and it ran on champagne, cash, and women. The role of the hostess was deliberately ambiguous. Officially, a hostess was a young woman employed to entertain gentlemen clients with conversation and to encourage the purchase of overpriced champagne. Unofficially, the spectrum ran from paid companion to prostitute, and the line between the two was left intentionally blurred by the club owners who profited from it, by the clients who preferred not to examine it, and by the women themselves, who understood that clarity was a luxury they could not afford. The man who controlled much of this world was Maurice Conley, a club owner sometimes described as the King of Soho. Conley ran his establishments with a blend of charm and menace. He hired young women, provided them with accommodation above the clubs, advanced them money against future earnings, and thereby created a system of dependency from which escape was extraordinarily difficult. If a girl tried to leave, Conley had leverage, debts, secrets, the threat of exposure. The door was always open. It simply led nowhere. Ruth worked for Conley. She was good at it. She could hold a conversation with a stockbroker at midnight and make him feel that he was the most fascinating man in London. She could drink without appearing drunk. She could smile through exhaustion. She could read a room, sense which man wanted flattery, which wanted argument, which wanted simply to be left alone with his whiskey and his thoughts. These were survival skills, honed in a childhood where reading the mood of a volatile father had been a matter of physical safety. Now she deployed them commercially, and the world rewarded her with money, attention, and the illusion of control. The clubs took everything and gave little back. Around 1950, according to certain biographies, they took something else. Ruth underwent an illegal abortion, the pregnancy reportedly the result of an encounter with a club client. No documents survive to confirm this. It remains an allegation, unproven and unprovable. But the context is important. Abortion was illegal in Britain until 1967, and for a woman in Ruth's position, the procedure would have been clandestine, dangerous, and carried out in conditions no medical authority would have sanctioned. It was against this backdrop, the clubs, the clients, the procedures carried out in back rooms, that Ruth made a decision which appeared on its surface to be an escape. On the 8th of November 1950, at the Register Office in Tonbridge, Kent, Ruth Nielsen married George Johnston Ellis. He was 41 years old, nearly twice her age, a divorced dentist with a practice, a respectable name, and a drinking problem he concealed with the practiced ease of the functioning alcoholic. Ruth was 24. She had a 6-year-old son and no prospects beyond the hostess clubs. George offered her something she had never possessed, a surname, a status, the word Mrs. before her name. She took it. The marriage was a disaster. George drank. George raged. George was consumed by a jealousy so corrosive that it poisoned every room he entered. When their daughter Georgina was born in October 1951, George declared that the child was not his. There is no evidence to support this claim. It appears to have been the product of his jealousy rather than any factual basis. And then something happened that the biographies mention only in passing, as though it were a footnote rather than a cry for help. During the marriage, Ruth attempted to take her own life. The method and the circumstances are barely recorded, a few words in a later account, nothing more. But the fact itself is confirmed. She tried to die, she failed, and she carried on. As she always did. Around the same time, in 1951, whilst pregnant with Georgina, Ruth appeared briefly in a film called Lady Godiva Rides Again, playing an uncredited beauty contest entrant. She was 4 months along. The film was a satire on the exploitation of female beauty. Among the cast were the young Diana Dawes and Joan Collins. Ruth befriended Dawes. The bitter coincidence of appearing in a satire about the very system that was consuming her went, it seems, unnoticed by everyone involved. The divorce, when it came, returned Ruth to exactly where she had started. A single mother, now with 2 children instead of 1, and no resources beyond her appearance and her talent for performing composure under duress. She went back to the clubs, but this time she went back differently. Conlai offered her something more than a hostess position. He made her the manageress of the little club on Brompton Road in Knightsbridge, not Soho, but a slightly more respectable address, a step up the invisible ladder of London's night world. She had a flat above the premises. She managed the staff. She controlled the door. For the first time in her life, she held a position of apparent authority. Apparent because Conlai still owned the building, still took his cut, and still held the power to take it all away. The flat was tied to the job. The job was tied to Conlai. And the clients, the racing drivers, the minor aristocrats, the former pilots with inherited money and restless evenings, were both her livelihood and her trap. One evening in 1953, 2 men walked into the little club. One of them would become the world motor racing champion. The other would end up dead on a Hampstead pavement. Mike Hawthorne was the famous one. Tall, blonde, impossibly handsome, with a jaw that belonged on a cigarette advertisement, and a reputation for driving racing cars at speeds that terrified even his mechanics. In 1958, he would win the Formula One World Championship. In January 1959, he would die in a road accident on the Guildford bypass, killed not by the racetrack, but by an ordinary English road on an ordinary English afternoon. But on this evening in 1953, He was simply a young man with money, charm, and a thirst for champagne, and he brought with him a friend. David Blakely entered the little club the way people enter rooms when they are accustomed to being welcome. A broad smile, a scarf tossed carelessly over a tweed jacket, the easy confidence of a man who had never, in his 24 years, been required to doubt his own importance. He was the son of a Sheffield doctor and the stepson of a woman whose expectations for him far exceeded his capacity to fulfill them. He called himself a racing driver, and in a limited sense this was true. He competed in minor events, tinkered with engines, and was building a racing car called the Emperor with a circle of friends that included an engineer named Anthony Findlater. But David Blakely was not Mike Hawthorne. He lacked the talent, the discipline, and the nerve. What he possessed instead was a facility for spending other people's money, his stepmother's, his friends', and eventually Ruth's, while maintaining the appearance of a gentleman for whom financial matters were simply beneath consideration. He was 3 years younger than the woman behind the bar. He was engaged to be married to another woman, a girl from his own social circle, the kind of match his family considered appropriate. None of this prevented him from staying until closing time, following the manageress upstairs, and beginning an affair that would end with 5 bullets on a pavement. Ruth was 27. She had survived her father, survived her husband, survived the clubs. She knew men. She knew what they wanted and how to provide it, and she knew, or believed she knew, the precise emotional distance required to remain safe. David Blakely dismantled every one of these defenses, not through cruelty that came later, but through something more disorienting: need. He needed her. He needed her attention, her reassurance, her bed, her money, her forgiveness. He was an overgrown boy playing at manhood, and he attached himself to her with the desperate tenacity of someone who had never learnt to stand alone. She mistook this for love. Perhaps it was love. The distinction in relationships built on damage is not always clear. For a time it worked, or appeared to. David stayed late at the club, ordered champagne he could not pay for, drove her through London in his sports car with the roof down. He introduced her to his racing friends, to the world of Silverstone and Brands Hatch, to weekends in the paddock where men talked about gear ratios and lap times, and women stood at the edges, holding coats. Ruth entered this world willingly. For the first time, she was not merely a hostess performing availability. She was somebody's girl. The change, when it came, was gradual. David began to drink more. He began to resent the club, the clients who spoke to Ruth, the men who lingered at the bar, the simple fact that her job required her to be charming to strangers. His jealousy expressed itself first as sulking, then as public scenes. He would arrive at the little club already drunk, overturn a table if he saw Ruth laughing with a customer, shout accusations across the room, while patrons stared into their glasses and pretended not to hear. Ruth lost her position as manageress. The connection between David's behavior and her dismissal was direct. Canlai did not tolerate disruption, and a lover who smashed furniture was bad for business. She was outstripped of her title, her flat, her fragile authority. She moved in with David, then away from him, then in with someone else, then back again. The pattern established itself with mechanical predictability: closeness, conflict, separation, reunion. And then the beatings began in earnest, or rather, the beatings that left visible marks. It is possible, even likely, that there had been earlier incidents, smaller cruelties absorbed and forgotten. But from late 1953 onward, the evidence became impossible to conceal. Bruises on her arms and face that she covered with makeup and long sleeves. At least one visit to hospital for injuries sustained at David's hands. Friends noticed. Acquaintances noticed. Nobody intervened. This was 1950s England. What a man did to his woman behind a closed door was a private matter, regrettable perhaps, but fundamentally none of anyone else's concern. The paradox, one of many in this story, was that David also proposed marriage. He struck her, and then he offered her a ring. She accepted, and then he vanished. He returned, contrite, bearing flowers or promises, or simply the overwhelming force of his physical presence, and the pattern resumed. Blow, remorse, promise, blow. In 1979, an American psychologist named Lenore Walker would give this cycle a clinical name and describe how victims become trapped not by locks or chains, but by the alternation of terror and tenderness, by the perpetual hope that this time the remorse is genuine, this time the promise will hold. But in 1954, no such language existed. Ruth had no framework within which to understand what was happening to her. She had only the old lesson learnt in a house in Wales: absorb the pain, say nothing, carry on. In the midst of this, there was Desmond. Desmond Edward Cusson was everything David Blakely was not. A former Royal Air Force pilot turned company director and accountant, he was older than Ruth, financially stable, and hopelessly, irrevocably in love with her. He was the kind of man who arrived with groceries without being asked, who remembered the children's birthdays, who never raised his voice. He was, in short, everything Ruth should have wanted, and he bored her to the point of cruelty. She lived with him intermittently, shuttling between his flat and David's in a triangular arrangement that satisfied nobody. Cusson wanted to marry her. She refused. She loved David, every time. Despite the black eyes and the split lips, and the nights spent waiting for him to come home reeking of whiskey and another woman's perfume, she chose David. Cusson watched and waited and said nothing, or almost nothing. The question of what Desmond Cusson said and did in the weeks before the 10th of April, 1955, would become the central mystery of this case, a mystery that remains, 7 decades later, unresolved. In January of that year, something broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, the way a crack runs through a foundation stone, invisible until the house falls. Ruth was pregnant. David struck her in the abdomen. The blow was deliberate, aimed, vicious. She lost the child. Medical evidence of the miscarriage would later be presented during the 2003 appeal, evidence that was never heard at the original trial, never considered by the jury, never weighed against the 5 bullets. Ruth continued to function. She dressed, she went out, she spoke to people, she even laughed. But something fundamental had shifted. A door had closed somewhere deep inside her, and behind it was the woman who still believed David would change. That woman was gone. What remained was someone else entirely, someone whom Ruth herself, perhaps, did not yet recognize. The Easter weekend of 1955 began on Thursday, the 7th of April. David announced that he was leaving, going to stay with friends, Anthony and Carol Findlater, at their flat in Tanzer Road, Hampstead. He was vague about his reasons. Ruth suspected another woman. She telephoned the Findlaters repeatedly over the following days. Each time she was told David was not there. She drove to Hampstead, saw his car, a green Vanguard, parked outside their address and understood that everyone was lying to her. She stood on the pavement for hours, a platinum blonde in a dark coat, motionless, staring upward at the windows. She came back the next day, and the next. The neighbors watched from behind their curtains and said nothing, because in 1950s England a woman standing on a street was not yet considered an emergency. On Sunday, the 10th of April, Easter Sunday, Ruth spent the daylight hours with Desmond Cusson. What passed between them during those hours is the hinge upon which this entire story turns. According to a statement Ruth made on the 12th of July, the day before her execution, to her solicitor Victor Miss Conn, the following occurred. Approximately 3 weeks before the shooting, Cusson had given her a loaded Smith & Wesson .38 caliber revolver. He had shown her how to use it. He had charged the weapon in her presence, and on the evening of Easter Sunday, he had driven her by car to Hampstead. If this statement is true, Desmond Cusson was an accessory to murder, a man who provided the weapon, the instruction, and the transport, and who then stepped back and allowed a woman in crisis to do what he must have known she would do. If the statement is false, then Ruth lied to her solicitor on the eve of her death, and the question becomes, why would a woman walking to the gallows invent such a story? She had nothing to gain. Clemency was impossible. The Home Secretary had already refused. She was not trying to save herself. She was, perhaps, trying to ensure that the world knew the full picture, or perhaps she was simply telling the truth. Cusson denied everything. He was never arrested, never questioned under caution, never charged. The statement was forwarded to the Home Office. No response came, but that is tomorrow's story. Tonight is Easter Sunday, and it is approximately 9:30 in the evening, and Ruth is standing on South Hill Park in Hampstead, outside a public house called the Magdala. The street is quiet. It is a residential neighborhood, Victorian terraces, pruned hedges, the kind of respectability that announces itself through net curtains and polished door knockers. The Magdala is a modest establishment, the sort of place where local men drink mild and bitter and discuss the football results. Inside, David Blakely has been drinking with a friend named Clive Gunnell. They have spent the evening at the Findlater's flat and have walked down to the pub for cigarettes and beer. Ruth is wearing a light-colored suit. Her hair is freshly bleached. In her handbag is the revolver. David and Clive emerged from the pub. David was carrying bottles of beer toward his car, the green Vanguard, parked at the curb. Ruth stood a few feet away. She called his name. He did not turn, or he turned and did not stop. The accounts differ. What is not disputed is what happened next. She took the revolver from her handbag. She fired 5 shots. The first struck him as he moved along the pavement. He stumbled, tried to run. 2 bullets hit him in the back as he fled. A 4th struck him after he had fallen beside his car. The 5th missed entirely. It ricocheted off the pavement and struck a passing woman named Gladys Yule in the thumb of her right hand. A random wound inflicted on a stranger who had been doing nothing more dangerous than walking home on Easter Sunday. David Blakely lay on the pavement beside his Vanguard. Beer from the shattered bottles pooled around him, mixing with blood. He was 25 years old. He had been dead, or very nearly so, before his body reached the ground. Ruth stood over him. She did not move. She did not run. She did not scream or weep or drop the weapon and flee into the Hampstead night. She stood perfectly still, as though she had arrived at a destination she had been traveling toward for a very long time, and there was, at last, nowhere else to go. A man, an off-duty citizen, not a police officer, approached her and gently took the revolver from her hand. She offered no resistance. Her voice, when she spoke, was level, controlled, eerily steady. She said, "Please call the police." The police arrived. An officer asked her what had happened. She said, "I shot him." 3 words, no elaboration, no excuse, no tears. In the stillness that followed, a Hampstead street on Easter night, broken only by distant church bells and the sound of beer trickling from broken glass onto the curb, Ruth Ellis became, though she did not yet know it, a symbol of everything that was about to change in British justice. She had been alive for 28 years. She had been a daughter, a mother, a wife, a hostess, a lover, a manageress, and now a killer. She had endured it all without protest. And now, standing on this pavement with the smell of cordite in the spring air, the silence was finally, irrevocably hers. They handcuffed her and led her to the waiting car. She went without resistance, without protest, with the composure of someone who has made a decision and is prepared to accept its consequences, all of them, including the one that waited behind a small, unremarkable door in Holloway Prison. But before the rope, there would be a courtroom. And in that courtroom, in the space of a single afternoon, the life of Ruth Ellis would be weighed, measured, and found by 12 men and women who knew nothing of peroxide or bruises or the particular silence of a house in Wales, to be worth less than the price of mercy. At the police station in Hampstead, Ruth gave her statement with the same unnerving composure she had displayed on the pavement. She sat upright. She answered questions clearly, precisely, without hesitation. She did not have a solicitor present. She had not requested one. She described what she had done in plain, declarative sentences, as though recounting an errand she had completed that afternoon. She had gone to Hampstead. She had waited outside the Magdala. She had shot David Blakely. She had intended to kill him. What she did not say was equally significant. She did not mention Desmond Cusson, not once. Not his name, not the revolver, not the car journey, not the shooting lessons. She shielded him completely, this man who, by her own later account, had placed the weapon in her hand and driven her to the scene. Speaking of Cusson and his role, she would later offer a partial explanation through legal intermediaries. "It is a betrayal to speak about it," she said. "The word is revealing. Not dangerous, not pointless. Betrayal, as though loyalty, even to a man who may have engineered her destruction, was a debt she could not bring herself to default on. Or perhaps she simply wanted to die. She had tried once before, during her marriage to George Ellis. She had failed then. Now the state was offering to succeed where she had not, and all she had to do was cooperate. Say nothing, protect no one. Let the machinery grind forward to its inevitable conclusion. She was charged with murder and remanded to Holloway Prison to await trial. The trial of Ruth Ellis opened on the 20th of June, 1955, at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, in London. It was, by any measure, a brief affair. The proceedings would last barely a day and a half. The jury would deliberate for less than half an hour, and the outcome, in retrospect, was never in doubt, not because the evidence was overwhelming, though it was, but because the woman in the dock had already been convicted by forces far more powerful than any jury. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the press gallery. Members of the public queued around the block. Ruth arrived in a black suit with a white silk blouse, her platinum hair freshly styled, her makeup immaculate. She looked, one journalist noted, as though she were attending a cocktail party rather than her own murder trial. The observation was not intended as a compliment. In 1950s Britain, a woman facing the gallows was expected to appear contrite, broken, repentant, ideally in drab clothing and with unwashed hair. Ruth, by presenting herself with poise and style, confirmed every prejudice the public and the jury already held. She was not a respectable woman brought low by tragic circumstance. She was a platinum blonde from a nightclub, a hostess. She drank gin. She had 2 children by different fathers, neither of whom she had managed to keep. She had lived with 2 men simultaneously. She was, in the language of the time, no better than she ought to be. This mattered. It mattered enormously. Because in a capital case, the question before the jury was not merely whether the defendant had committed the act. Ruth had freely admitted that she had, but whether there were grounds for mercy. And mercy, in the unwritten moral code of the English legal system, was reserved for women who deserved it. Good women, decent women, women whose fundamental respectability was not in question. Ruth Ellis, with her bleached hair and her nightclub and her 2 lovers, did not qualify. The judge was Sir Cecil Havers, a man of conventional temperament and conventional opinions. The prosecutor was Christmas Humphreys, a figure of such improbable contradictions that a novelist would hesitate to invent him. Humphreys was a practicing Buddhist, a scholar of Zen philosophy, an author of books on meditation and the middle way. He was also one of the most formidable prosecutors of his generation, a man whose courtroom manner combined intellectual precision with an absolute absence of sentiment. A Buddhist sending a battered woman to the gallows. The bitter paradox was lost on nobody, except, perhaps, on Humphreys himself. The defense was led by Melford Stevenson, who would later become one of the most notoriously harsh judges in English legal history. Whether his temperament as a future judge influenced his performance as Ruth's advocate is impossible to say. What can be said is that his defense strategy was catastrophic. Stevenson attempted to argue manslaughter, that Ruth had killed not with premeditation, but in a sudden loss of control, provoked beyond endurance. It was not an unreasonable argument. The evidence of provocation was substantial, but Stevenson called no medical experts. He did not mention the miscarriage. He offered the jury no context, nothing that might explain how a woman arrives at the point of pulling a trigger. The beatings, the hospital visit, the child lost to a deliberate blow, none of it was heard. The jury was left with a single image, a jealous blonde with a revolver. And then Christmas Humphreys stood up and asked the question that killed Ruth Ellis more surely than the rope. Mrs. Ellis, when you fired that revolver at close range into the body of David Blakely, what did you intend to do? Ruth's answer was immediate. Her voice did not waver. It was obvious that when I shot him, I intended to kill him. The courtroom went silent. Stevenson closed his eyes, and that, for all practical purposes, was the end. Under the law as it stood in 1955, murder was defined as the unlawful killing of another person with the intent to kill or cause grievous bodily harm. Ruth had just confirmed, in her own words under oath, that she had intended to kill. There was no defense of diminished responsibility. That concept would not enter English law until the Homicide Act of 1957. There was no defense of provocation that could survive such a clear admission of intent. There was, in the lexicon available to the court, No way to say what was true, that Ruth Ellis had been broken by years of brutality, and that her brokenness, not her malice, had pulled the trigger. The jury retired. They returned in somewhere between 14 and 23 minutes. The sources disagree, but all agree that it was shockingly brief. The foreman stood, guilty of murder. Sir Cecil Havers placed the black cap upon his head and pronounced the only sentence the law allowed: death by hanging. Ruth received the verdict without flinching. She was led from the dock with the same measured tread with which she had entered it. She did not look at the gallery. She descended the stairs to the cells below and passed out of public sight. But above her, in the courtroom and beyond it, a storm was gathering. The conviction divided Britain with a ferocity that surprised even those who had followed the case closely. Tens of thousands signed a petition for clemency. Hundreds of letters flooded the Home Office, the overwhelming majority pleading for mercy. Newspapers that had initially treated the case as sordid entertainment began to shift their tone. Editorials appeared asking whether a woman who had been beaten, degraded, and driven to despair truly deserved the same punishment as a calculating, premeditated killer. The answer was provided by a single man. The Home Secretary, Gwilym Lloyd George, held the power to commute the sentence. In a coincidence that history might have contrived for dramatic effect, Gwilym was the son of David Lloyd George, the great liberal reformer who had championed the cause of the common people against the entrenched interests of the powerful. The son looked at the petition, at the letters, at the outcry, and he refused. No commutation, no reprieve. The sentence would stand. His reasons were never fully articulated in public. The official position was that the law was clear. Privately, it was widely understood that Ruth's manner of living weighed heavily against her. She was not a wronged wife defending her children. She was a woman of loose morals, a habituée of nightclubs, a kept woman who moved between men as it suited her. The establishment closed ranks. Her way of life had become, in effect, part of her sentence, judged not merely for the 5 bullets, but for everything she had been before them. Ruth, for her part, did not fight. She refused to lodge an appeal. Her legal team urged her, begged her, by some accounts, to challenge the verdict. She declined. She wrote no letters to the Home Secretary. She mounted no campaign for her own survival. Whether this was courage, resignation, or a form of self-destruction disguised as dignity remains an open question. What is certain is that Ruth Ellis did not wish to be saved. David was dead. Her children would be better off without the burden of a mother who was a convicted killer. The gallows, in its terrible way, offered something her life never had: an ending, clean, final, hers. 3 weeks separated sentence from execution. 21 days in a small room in the condemned wing of Holloway Prison, watched around the clock by 2 female officers whose sole duty was to ensure she did not cheat the hangman by taking her own life. The state, having decided to kill this woman, was determined that nobody else, including Ruth herself, should do so first. Behind an unremarkable door in the adjacent room, painted the same institutional green as every other, was the execution chamber. The drop, the beam, the rope. Ruth may not have known it was there, or perhaps she did. Holloway was not a large prison, and sounds carried through old walls. The death watch officers expected hysteria. They were accustomed to it, the screaming, the bargaining, the collapse. What they got instead unnerved them far more than tears would have done. Ruth smoked. She drank tea. She conversed with the officers about ordinary things. The weather, the wireless, what was in the newspapers. She read letters from supporters. She had never met strangers who had written to express sympathy, outrage, solidarity. She replied to some of them in a neat, careful hand. One of the officers, speaking years later, said she was the most composed prisoner she had ever seen in all her years of service. But it was the officers themselves who could not sleep at night, lying awake in the staff quarters, staring at the ceiling, dreading the morning that was coming. The woman they were guarding rested soundly. The women paid to watch her did not. She received visitors. Her mother, Bertha, came. The older woman wept. Ruth did not. What passed between them is not recorded in detail. Bertha, who had spent a lifetime in silence, who had known what was happening in her own house and had done nothing, now sat opposite her daughter in a prison cell and cried for what could not be undone. Her son came. Andrea, everyone called him Andy, was 10 years old. He was brought to the prison, led through corridors that smelt of disinfectant and boiled vegetables, and ushered into a room where his mother sat waiting. What she said to him in those minutes is one of the small, sacred mysteries of this story. Andy never told anyone. Not as a boy, not as a young man, not in the decades of anguish that followed. He carried whatever words she gave him through the rest of his life, and he carried them alone, and they were not enough to save him. Her daughter, Georgina, was 3 years old. Ruth did not ask for her to be brought. The child was too young to understand, too young to remember. Ruth, making perhaps the last maternal decision available to her, chose to spare her daughter the memory of a prison visit and a mother who would not be coming home. It was an act of love expressed through absence. And then, on the 12th of July, one day before the execution, a solicitor arrived. Victor Miscon was a young lawyer in 1955. He would go on to become one of the most prominent legal figures in Britain. Baron Miscon of Lambeth, a life peer, the man who in the 1990s represented the Princess of Wales during her separation from the Prince. But on this July afternoon, he was simply a man with a briefcase, sitting across a table from a condemned woman, and what she told him changed his understanding of the case entirely. Ruth spoke carefully. She had something to add to the record, something she had not previously disclosed. Desmond Cusson had given her the revolver, approximately 3 weeks before the shooting. He had brought it to her, loaded it in her presence, and demonstrated how to fire it. On the evening of Easter Sunday, he had driven her by car to Hampstead. He had dropped her near the Magdala. He had driven away. Miss Conn listened. He took notes. He asked questions. Ruth answered them with the same measured precision she had maintained throughout, no drama, no embellishment. She was not making an accusation. She was not asking for a reprieve. She was simply, finally, telling the truth, or what she said was the truth, because she was going to die in the morning and she wanted someone to know. Miss Conn left the prison and immediately contacted the Home Office. He conveyed the substance of Ruth's statement and urged that the execution be stayed pending investigation. A woman had named an accessory to murder. Surely this warranted, at minimum, a delay. The Home Office did not respond. No stay was granted. No investigation was opened. No police officer was dispatched to question Desmond Cusson. The machinery of execution continued to turn, undisturbed by the possibility that the full truth had not yet been told. Miss Conn was shaken. He would remain shaken for the rest of his life. He preserved every document, the notes, the correspondence, the unanswered letters, and decades later made them available for the appeal of 2003. He went to his grave believing that the execution of Ruth Ellis was a miscarriage of justice. Not because she was innocent of pulling the trigger, but because the full circumstances had been deliberately left unexplored. On the same evening, Ruth wrote a letter. It was addressed to Mrs. Cook, the birth mother of David Blakely, not the stepmother with whom David had had a fraught relationship. The letter has survived. It reads, in part, "Dear Mrs. Cook, I have always loved your son very much. I shall not ask you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I shall die still loving him." The words are remarkable for what they contain and for what they leave out. There is no apology for the act itself. There is, instead, an apology for pain, for the grief she has caused a mother by taking her son. And there is an assertion of love so absolute that it survives even the act of killing. She did not write that she had loved him, the past tense, the completed act. She wrote that she would die still loving him, not loved, loving, as though the feeling had no end, not even the end she herself had caused. She understood Mrs. Cook's pain because she was a mother herself. She had lost a child, not to a bullet, but to a fist, in a rented flat in London 3 months earlier. She knew what it meant to have a life torn from your body. And now she had torn a life from another woman's world. And the symmetry, victim becoming perpetrator, bereaved becoming bereaver, was the final, perfect closure of a circle that had begun turning long before Ruth Ellis was born. That night, her last, she refused sedation. Whether she was given a glass of brandy remains uncertain. The accounts disagree, and the truth of it has been lost. She slept several hours, according to the death watch officers. If this is true, it is perhaps the most astonishing detail in the story that a woman who knew she would be dead by mid-morning could close her eyes and surrender to unconsciousness. She woke early on the morning of the 13th of July, 1955. She washed. She dressed. She drank a cup of tea. A prison chaplain arrived and administered Holy Communion, the body and blood of Christ, offered to a woman whose own body and blood would, within the hour, be forfeit. She accepted it quietly. The clock moved toward 9. These are speculations, but the silence of the authorities is not speculation. It is documented, it is absolute, and it is damning. The world Ruth had inhabited, the Mayfair clubs, the hostess circuit, the overlapping networks of glamour and shadow, would erupt into public view 8 years later, when Stephen Ward and the Profumo affair laid bare the connections between London's demi-monde and the corridors of power. Whether Ruth's path ever crossed Ward's directly is unknown. No document links them. But they moved through the same geography, the same decade, the same circles, and the possibility has fueled speculation that has never been conclusively resolved. The second ripple reached George Ellis, Ruth's former husband, the dentist from Tonbridge, 3 years after the hanging. George had never recovered. His dental practice emptied. His drinking, which had been chronic before the marriage, became the entirety of his existence. He lived alone, in a succession of rented rooms, with a surname that had become notorious for reasons no amount of whiskey could erase. In 1958, George Johnston Ellis took his own life. The connection between Ruth's death and his own was never formally established, but the chronology speaks for itself. He survived her by 3 years and then followed her into the ground, another casualty in a story that consumed everyone it touched. The third ripple, the cruelest, the most protracted, reached the children. Andrea Nielsen, Andy, the boy from the prison visit, was 10 years old when his mother was hanged. He was old enough to understand what had happened, old enough to read the newspapers, old enough to hear the whispers at school and in the street. He was sent to live with relatives. Which relatives, under what conditions, with what degree of warmth or reluctance, is not recorded in the detail it deserves. He grew up in the shadow of a name that was famous for all the wrong reasons. It preceded him into every classroom, every job interview, every relationship. It was indelible. He did not thrive. He drank. He struggled to hold employment and to maintain relationships. He carried within him the weight of that final prison visit. Whatever his mother had said, whatever words she had chosen, whatever impossible comfort she had attempted to offer a boy who was about to lose everything. He carried it, and it grew heavier with each passing year. And in 1982, at the age of 37, Andrea Nielsen hanged himself in a derelict outhouse. The method demands attention. The son of a woman killed by hanging chose hanging. Whether this was a deliberate mirroring, a final, dreadful identification with the mother who had been taken from him, or the arbitrary selection of a means by a man in unbearable pain, is impossible to determine. What is not impossible to determine is that the execution of Ruth Ellis did not end with Ruth Ellis. It reached forward across 27 years and closed its hand around her son's throat, and the state that had killed the mother bore no official responsibility for the destruction of the child. Georgina Ellis, the daughter, the 3-year-old who had been spared the prison visit, grew up in a foster family. She did not learn the truth about her mother until adolescence. One can only imagine the moment of discovery, the realization that the woman who gave you life was not merely absent but infamous, not merely dead but executed, not merely a criminal but a symbol, a headline, a cautionary tale retold in books and newspapers, and eventually films. Georgina absorbed this knowledge, and in time transformed it into purpose. In her later years, she dedicated herself to the campaign for a posthumous review of her mother's conviction. She argued through solicitors, through the Criminal Cases Review Commission, through every legal channel available, that the original trial had been fundamentally flawed, relevant evidence suppressed, the defense incompetent, the jury denied the full picture of what Ruth had endured. She argued that her mother had been a victim of sustained violence long before she became a perpetrator, and that the law's failure to recognize this had produced a grotesque injustice. She did not live to see the outcome. Georgina died of cancer in 2001, 2 years before the Court of Appeal heard the case. She was 49, her mother's daughter in more ways than she would have wished, destined to die too young, with too much left unfinished. The appeal was heard in September 2003. It rested on everything the original trial had ignored. The statement to Miss Conn, a dying woman's accusation, filed and forgotten. The medical evidence of sustained brutality, the beatings, the hospital records, the miscarriage, that the jury never heard. And a legal concept that had not existed in 1955, but that, had it existed, might have saved her, diminished responsibility. The argument that a mind broken by years of violence is not the same mind that plans a murder in cold blood. The court considered the submissions with care. The judges acknowledged the force of the arguments. They expressed what the written judgment described as deep sympathy for Ruth Ellis and for the circumstances that had led to the shooting. They conceded that under modern law, the outcome might well have been different, and then they dismissed the appeal. Their reasoning was precise, and in its way unanswerable. The conviction must be judged by the standards of the time at which it was imposed. In 1955, the law did not recognize diminished responsibility. Provocation could not survive a clear admission of intent. The jury had applied the law as it existed. The judge had sentenced as the law required. The fact that the law had since changed, that society had since changed, that the understanding of domestic violence had been revolutionized, could not be applied retrospectively. Deep sympathy, but not vindication, not exoneration, not the admission that something had gone terribly, systemically wrong. Ruth's granddaughter continued the campaign in the years that followed, pressing for a further review. The results were the same: sympathy without substance, acknowledgement without action. The conviction stands to this day. There is one more witness to be heard, not a relative, not a lawyer, not a politician, a craftsman. Albert Pierrepoint retired from his position as executioner and opened a public house. The man who had spent his professional life taking people to the drop now stood behind a bar and served them pints. He called the pub "Help the Poor Struggler." One hopes the name was intentional. In 1974, he published his autobiography. It is a remarkable document, spare, precise, entirely devoid of self-pity or sensationalism. He describes his career with the detachment of a surgeon recounting operations. But toward the end, reflecting on the hundreds of men and women he had dispatched, he arrives at a conclusion that carries the weight of bitter experience. "I have come to the conclusion," he wrote, "that executions solve nothing and are no deterrent to a person determined to commit murder. The death of this woman achieved nothing except the suffering of all involved." The hangman repudiated the rope. The man who had stood on one side of the trapdoor for a quarter of a century crossed, in his conscience, to the other side. Hanging did not work. It had never worked. It killed people without preventing killing. It satisfied a principle without serving a purpose. And then there was Gladys Yule, the woman nobody remembers. She had been walking along South Hill Park on Easter Sunday, doing nothing more noteworthy than making her way home. She was struck in the thumb by a ricocheting bullet, the fifth shot, the one that missed David Blakely and found, instead, a random stranger. She survived. The wound healed. Her name appeared in the court records, and then she vanished from the narrative as completely as if she had never existed. Almost nothing is known about her life thereafter. She left no memoir. She gave no interviews. She is a footnote, literally, a footnote in the legal documents, and yet she matters. She matters because she embodies a truth that every act of violence contains, but that most accounts of violence prefer to ignore. That a revolver fired in rage strikes not only the person at whom it is aimed, but the world around them. David Blakely died. Andrea Nielsen died 27 years later. Georgina Ellis died 46 years later. George Ellis died 3 years later. And Gladys Yule went home with a hole in her thumb and a story she apparently never told. And she is perhaps the truest symbol of what violence does. It ripples outward, indiscriminate and uncontainable, touching lives that have no place in the drama except as collateral. The legal consequences of Ruth's death accumulated slowly, like sediment deposited by a river that would not stop flowing. 2 years after the execution, Parliament passed the Homicide Act of 1957. For the first time in English legal history, a defendant could argue diminished responsibility, that their mind had been so damaged, so overwhelmed by suffering or illness, that they could not fully govern their actions. Had this defense existed 2 years earlier, Ruth's barrister could have called psychiatrists, presented the hospital records, described the miscarriage in clinical detail. The jury would have heard a different story, not of a cold-blooded killer, but of a woman whose capacity for rational judgment had been systematically destroyed by the man she loved. The verdict might have been manslaughter. The sentence might have been years in prison, not a rope around her neck. The debates that preceded the act invoked Ruth Ellis by name. Her case was cited repeatedly in the Commons, in the Lords, in newspaper editorials, as evidence that the existing law was too blunt, too rigid, too incapable of distinguishing between degrees of culpability. A woman battered beyond endurance and a poisoner who murdered for an inheritance were, under the old law, identical in the eyes of the court. Both were guilty of murder. Both faced the same penalty. The Homicide Act acknowledged, at last, that this equivalence was a fiction, a legal convenience that bore no relationship to moral reality. The cases of Timothy Evans and Derek Bentley had already shaken the nation's faith in the scaffold. Evans had been hanged in 1950 for the murder of his wife and infant daughter at 10 Rillington Place. It was later established, conclusively, damningly, that the actual killer was Evans's neighbor, John Reginald Christie, a serial murderer who had manipulated the police investigation and allowed an innocent man to go to the gallows. Evans received a posthumous pardon in 1966, 16 years too late, an apology delivered to a grave. Derek Bentley, a 19-year-old with severe learning difficulties, had been hanged in 1953 for his alleged role in the shooting of a police officer during a botched burglary. It was not Bentley who fired the fatal shot, but his companion, Christopher Craig, who was too young to hang and was instead imprisoned. Bentley's ambiguous cry of "Let him have it, Chris," which might have meant hand over the gun or might have meant shoot, was deemed sufficient to send him to the gallows. He was posthumously pardoned in 1998, 45 years after his death. Evans, who was innocent. Bentley, who was guilty of nothing more than being present and being slow of mind. And Ruth Ellis, who was guilty of murder, but who was also guilty of something the court could not name and the law could not measure, of being a woman whom every institution in her life had failed. Failed as a child, failed as a wife, failed as a defendant, failed as a human being who deserved, at some point in her 28 years, to have someone stand between her and the next blow. 3 cases broke the scaffold in Britain. In 1965, Parliament went further. The Murder Abolition of Death Penalty Act suspended capital punishment for a period of 5 years. In 1969, the suspension was made permanent. The gallows were dismantled. The ropes were coiled and stored and eventually discarded. The execution chambers at Holloway, at Pentonville, at Wandsworth were converted into storage rooms or offices, their trapdoors sealed, their beams removed. No one would hang in Britain again. Ruth Ellis did not set out to change the law. She did not campaign, did not write manifestos, did not march. She shot a man outside a pub because he had broken something inside her that could not be repaired, and then she stood still and waited for the consequences. But her death, the particular, unbearable specificity of it, The bleached hair, the bruises beneath the makeup, the steady voice in the dock, the 12 seconds, the crucifix on the wall, entered the national consciousness in a way that abstract arguments about penology never could. She was not a statistic or a principle. She was a woman. She had a face, a voice, a name. And the country that killed her could not, in the end, look at that face and defend what it had done. There was one more piece of unfinished business. It arrived 21 years after the execution, and it addressed not the manner of Ruth's death, but the manner of her life. In 1976, Parliament passed the Domestic Violence and Matrimonial Proceedings Act, the first legislation in British history to recognise that what happened behind a closed door was not a private matter, but a public responsibility. For the first time, a woman being beaten by her partner could seek a court injunction, could obtain legal protection, could appeal to the state for help rather than relying on the mercy of neighbours, the indifference of police, or the silence of a society that preferred not to know. It was a modest beginning, inadequate, underfunded, inconsistently enforced. But it was a beginning. 21 years too late for Ruth Ellis. 21 years too late for the child she lost to a fist in January 1955. But not too late for the women who came after, who lived because the law had finally, belatedly, acknowledged that a bruise inflicted by a husband was not a domestic disagreement, but an act of violence, and that the woman who bore it deserved something better than silence. Today, 7 decades after the execution, the name of Ruth Ellis occupies a peculiar place in British memory. She is not a heroine. She is not a martyr. She is not entirely a victim, because she pulled a trigger and took a life, and no amount of context can erase that fact. But neither is she simply a murderer, because the story that led to the Magdala on Easter Sunday was not a story of malice, but of destruction, slow, systematic, and carried out by every hand that ever touched her, from the first hand raised in a house in Wales to the last fist driven into her abdomen in a London flat. She exists in the space between guilt and innocence, between justice and cruelty, between the law as it was and the law as it should have been. She is uncomfortable. She resists simplification. She refuses to be reduced to a headline or a moral lesson. And perhaps that is why she endures, because the questions she raised have never been fully answered, and because the country that killed her has never quite been able to say with certainty that it was right to do so. In Amersham, in a quiet churchyard, the headstone stands. Ruth Hornby, 1926 to 1955. The grave is modest, unadorned, indistinguishable from those around it. Visitors come occasionally, researchers, journalists, the simply curious. They stand for a moment, read the inscription, and leave. There are no flowers, or if there are, they do not last. The wind moves through the churchyard, as it moves through all churchyards, without preference, without judgment, touching the stones of the righteous and the condemned alike. It carries no memory of the Magdala, or the little club, or the courtroom at the Old Bailey, or the small room in Holloway where a woman drank her last cup of tea and looked at a crucifix on a wall. It carries nothing. It is only wind. But somewhere beneath that stone lies the answer to a question that Britain has been asking for 70 years and has never satisfactorily resolved. Not whether Ruth Ellis was guilty, she was. Not whether she deserved punishment, she did. But whether the punishment she received was justice, or whether it was something else. The final act of a system that had failed her from the beginning and that chose, in the end, to destroy what it could not be bothered to save. The question hangs in the air still, like cordite. Like the sound of a name called on a quiet street. Like the silence of a woman who learnt, long ago, that speaking would change nothing, and who was right, in the end, about everything except the one thing that mattered most. She thought her silence would protect the people she loved. It did not protect her son. It did not protect her daughter. It did not protect Gladys Yule, walking home on Easter Sunday with a thumb she would never fully trust again. It did not protect David Blakely, who might have lived if someone, anyone, had intervened before the evening when intervention became impossible. And it did not protect Ruth. On a grey morning in March 1955, a woman sat before a mirror and bleached her hair. Her eye was swollen shut. Her lip was split. She had lost a child 2 weeks earlier. She had 3 weeks left to live, though she did not know it yet. She reached for the peroxide, and she began to transform herself, one more time, into someone the world could bear to look at. She did not know that she was already the most important woman in Britain, not for what she had done, but for what her death would make possible. She did not know that the rope waiting for her in Holloway would become the last rope, that no woman would ever again walk that short distance from cell to scaffold in this country. She did not know that her name would be spoken in Parliament, cited in legal textbooks, whispered in shelters for battered women as the name of someone who had paid the ultimate price for a system that offered her nothing, no escape, no language, no defense, no mercy. She knew none of this. She knew only the mirror and the bruise and the peroxide fizzing against her scalp and the steady, practiced movements of a woman who had learnt to make herself presentable in circumstances that would have broken anyone else. The face in the mirror stared back at her. It was the face of the last woman to be hanged in Great Britain, but it was also the face of every woman who had been silenced, struck, and told to carry on. Every woman who had smiled through a split lip. Every woman who had put on her makeup and walked downstairs and poured drinks for strangers because the alternative, speaking, protesting, demanding that someone listen, seemed more dangerous than the fist. Ruth Ellis did not change the world on purpose. She changed it by dying. And the world that killed her has spent 70 years trying to decide whether to be grateful or ashamed. It has not yet made up its mind.